Welcome to the sixth in a series of online interviews with Richard Harvey about the Panchavati Discourses. My name is Rob Meager, and today's interview will discuss the lecture, The End of Seeking, from the Panchavati Discourses. This lecture was given online on April 17, 2013, and it is available in written form in Dharma Sky, an ebook you can order at the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. You can also listen to the full recording of many of these lectures at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/education. And now a little bit of background about Richard Harvey. He's a psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He's the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century that proposes a three-stage model of human awakening. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and the Flight of Consciousness, among many other publications. He works with people all around the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. It's now my pleasure to welcome Richard to the call.
Thank you, Robert.
Good to be with you as always.
You
Hello. Good afternoon there, and a good morning from here in Ottawa. You waste no time at all in this lecture getting to the heart of the matter, or the title of the lecture being The End of Seeking. And I'm going to begin with just one paragraph leading to an opening question. Of course, the title again of the lecture, The End of Seeking, and almost right near the beginning, you begin a section that you titled Spiritual Preparation is Seeking, and you share. I want to start by making a very clear point. In my explanation of the human condition, seeking is absolutely applicable in the psychological stage that is in the first and the beginning of the second stages of awakening. However, it has no place whatsoever in the later stages of the second stage of awakening and the third stage. Advanced spiritual teachings tell us that seeking must be dropped altogether, and this is right, but only when applied to the prepared spiritual student or inner traveler. The preparation itself requires allowing all the egoistic tendencies, and particularly seeking, to arise and be played out, to grow and be absorbed in the futility of the ego tendencies over time. This is an essential part of the spiritual preparation that is involved in the spiritual adept's preparation for authentic spiritual practice and sacred life. And then you go on to speak about seeking having to be transcended. The key clause or words in that opening paragraph that I wanted to hone in on was this part about it has to be dropped altogether, but only when applied to the prepared spiritual student. And I wanted to ask, what happens when the unprepared seeker or spiritual student practices non-seeking?
I think two things. One is he or she cannot do it because they're not prepared. And the other thing that comes to mind is that you can, and as you know, we're in a field here of human psychology and spirituality in which, mind, thought the intellect is very close to the spiral at the top of the head, the Sahasrara, the seventh chakra, energy center of enlightenment, of surrender and spontaneity and so on. And we can, it seems, think ourselves into these places, maybe because they're so close together. When you look at the rather strange, in some ways, design of the human organism, there's all kinds of strange parts and functions of the body that are strangely put together and in the same sort of vicinity. This is one of those, that we can so easily think ourselves into surrender or spontaneity, or into non-seeking, for example, and to the degree that who's going to challenge you? Who's going to say, no, that's not for real? I have found personally that I can challenge people about what's not real, but it really took a long time. It took a very long time. In fact, I don't even have to meet people now. This isn't me telling you how fine I am or anything like that. It's just a matter of fact that after you put enough years in and you go through enough veils of hallucination and delusion and whatever, of which, I've been through many because I was at least as tricky as most. I can see people when they're in the same kind of bogs as I've been in. I can see it. It's very, very apparent to me. And one of the things that is very clear is that we can be involved in inner work for a very long time. I mean, very long time in terms of how we see it comparatively, because people don't like to think about 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, and yet these are realistic lengths of time. If we're talking about third stage awakening and the preparation before it, it's at least that length of time. So I am constantly being sold these instant enlightenment ideas from people I talk to, who are telling me that I'm simply pushing this idea of time and doing it thoroughly and all of that. And I take their point, but I'm afraid I'm not convinced. If we are going to also fall into delusion, as in, for example, thinking ourselves into not seeking when it isn't absolutely authentic, I do know this: we set ourselves back. I mean, you set yourself back because you've fallen into a magic place. The songs of the sirens, you're trying to get through the clashing rocks, and suddenly you're under a spell, and you believe in it. You think it's the case. There's many experiences I had myself that I was convinced were spiritual. I was sure they were spiritual. I'm sure they were evidence of my spirituality, shall we say. I look back now and I consider them exalted human experiences. Not because, I wish to describe them a different way, but because in a deeper understanding of the transpersonal, of the spiritual realms, you realize the human realms are really quite wonderful. And they are transcendent within the human realms, but they're not transcendental as in transcendent in the spiritual realms. It's a different matter. So the unprepared student who is seeking, not seeking, is certainly not able to do it, but is certainly able to fall, of course, as ever, into delusion and think that he or she is doing it, which will take them further away from the authentic state of not seeking.
One of the things that is still resonating with me from what you shared is we can think our way in or out of anything. I think you talked about thinking our way out of something, or maybe you said thinking our way into something, but we can think our way in and out of anything. we want to. Very brief comment you shared shortly after that opening paragraph. It was under a section you titled about Kriyas, what are Kriyas? And you shared that the body is psyche. This is a relatively recent insight in holistic psychotherapy. The gross form of the inner soul is expressed in the world of the physical, energetic form. Now, when you say for the body is psyche, do you mean the body is an illusion of our thoughts and our mind?
It's curious because I've just been talking about this with somebody else this morning. You see, the ego, which is what we're talking about here really in relationship to the inner and outer individual organism, the expressions of egoistic processes in their finest and their most base forms. We are in a different relationship to that process according to where we are, and I've defined it in 3 stages. The first stage is the personality, the second is the heart stage, and the third stage is from preparation as a genuinely spiritual stage. Rather merges into the final stages of the second stage, awakening. It means that as you move into the heart as an individual egoic personality in time, you naturally develop and grow through that into a heartfelt state of, if you're inclined, spiritual preparedness that then will take you into third stage awakening, or the truly spiritual life. Which is, in my terminology, no compromise. It isn't a place of, it's not occasional meditation retreat and so forth, and reading a book by, who we won't name. It's none of those sorts of things. It's a total commitment. It's a total commitment. In the first stage awakening, your work on the personality means you take the body, the psyche, the soul, the ego processes very, 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 very seriously, to the degree that if your ego is not developed healthily and fully through the desire and the fear body and your experiences of dependency and all of these first years of life, which are seminal in developing the character and personality which is reactive, shall we say, to the meeting with the world, essentially defending you from meeting the world, you must take yourself incredibly seriously. There's no point then, truly, in picking up what the Upanishads, or some, the Bhagavad Gita or the Yoga Sutras and what have you, and looking at that stuff, because you will be confused as hell. And indeed, of course, people are confused as hell, and I've worked with hundreds of these people, and I've written books simply to address this issue. And the issue is, how can we let go of something that we don't already have, that is itself fulfilled, that it's been made? How can we destroy this something which we haven't even yet created? And the answer is a paradox, but it's not a paradox in the human divine sense that I speak of. Paradox is a paradox in the literal sense. There is nothing you can do with an undeveloped ego from a spiritual point of view. Therefore, to try and ground us back in the question, you take the body and the psyche and your emotions and your individual narrative and all of this, you take your Robertness in that sense, my Richardness in that sense, incredibly seriously. It is what you focus on and intensely work through in terms of unfinished business, in terms of all of your adherence to the past, until it's over. Until, through the stages of authentic forgiveness, you transcend forgiveness itself. This is something I was talking about this morning, because the person I was talking to was confused about forgiving you when you did something to them and then getting on and having a good time rather than holding a grudge. And what I'm talking about in Your Essential Self, which is a process of forgiveness where you transcend forgiveness altogether as a principle, as an experience, as an actuality, and you take complete self-responsibility for life. And as you know, Robert, after that I speak of wholeness, which is the relieving yourself of the shadow side or any denied aspects of self, embracing yourself in your darkness as well as your brightness, and then potentially, and again not absolutely inevitable, but according to your tendencies, you face the threshold, which is crossing, which you've never faced before, into the second stage awakening. And here the matter of body and psyche and soul and ego processes are addressed in an entirely different way. They're subordinated to processes of love and compassion and authenticity. They are relatively minor in comparison to the first stage, but you are not yet relinquishing them, you see. Now in the third stage, forget it altogether. It's not that in the third stage you won't have to deal with the ego. You will have to deal with the ego to very high stages of spiritual attainment. But it's really not your concern. It's rather like at that point, you just let it slough off. You don't give it, attention whatsoever. So these are three very different relationships, and they're appropriate according to the stage or the level of practice.
You've come to know that forgiveness is a particular passion of mine. It's certainly a process that I'm still learning about, but it was interesting to hear you talk about it because there's much alignment between what you share and anyone who's read your book, Your Essential Self, and other material on the process of forgiveness. But what you share in common with what I'll say is faith traditions' processes of forgiveness, not the surface level take on forgiveness, but the deep truth about forgiveness. You go on in the lecture to share a wonderful story from, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I'm going to pronounce it Georg Feuerstein, or Feuerstein. His book, Holy Madness, The Shock Tactics and Radical Teachings of Crazy Wise Adepts, Holy Fools, and Rascal Gurus. And this story could be summed up as teaching us that we hide behind our minds. And this is a continuation of what we just talked about is, for the body is psyche. But this story that you shared teaches us that we hide behind our minds. And what I wanted to ask you was, how was it revealed to you that you hide behind your mind?
In my experience, you mean, in my individual journey?
In your individual journey, in your individual experience, how did you become aware, how was it revealed to you that you hide behind your mind?
I think in so many ways, thousands and thousands of ways. I think that it was, I'd like to, come up with a pointed story or a pointed lesson or something like that, but it wasn't like that in my experience. I don't know if it is for some. It was rather accruing as a lesson. It was rather constant because it always was the case. Very, very early on, I can remember with other young men and women challenging each other about things which, when I look back on, were precisely that. We would contemplate in a way, your idea of love isn't love, for example. In fact, your idea of anything isn't love. We, in those days, for example, had the very old big blue hardback Course in Miracles books, which had this wonderful opening, which it was enough to just be staggered by the very first lesson, which is the world I see is not the real world. I'm doing my best to quote it, I think, more or less.
Yeah.
And we looked out and we said, well, yeah, there's a good start. And in fact, there's a place I don't know if I can even get to lesson 2 at this point, because that was so.
Yeah.
I think that Gestalt therapy was fantastic in that regard, for example, because Gestalt therapy and in the book of that name, as I recall, there's many good exercises. This is the book by Fritz Perls. There's 3 authors of this book, Perls, someone, and Heffelin, I forget now. And but these exercises that we would do, these experiential exercises, taught us that we didn't apprehend the world in any real kind of a way, because our mind was there. Zen did it, Tantric meditation did it, Theravadan Buddhist retreats did it, for me, all these things. India, what do you call it, dancing in circles, Rumi's discipline did it. What's it called? Kirtan did it, Vipassana did it, encounter groups did it, being challenged in those days did it. Everything really was part of that, was telling me that what I thought and who I was and how I was not actually true. It was very humbling. I was proud and arrogant enough. There were many times I thought, the hell with this, because the whole world was shaking sometimes. There was no new reference points, just the old ones being taken away. It's one of the things that in intensive psychological, psychotherapeutic, particularly group work, certainly in those days, and sometimes if you come here, we can do. People feel disoriented. They're losing their reference points, and there's no new ones proposed yet. Other than probably better get back to the next group, and scrape away a little bit more. You can't live through mind. It was, as Rudolf Steiner said about the philosopher Descartes, a huge mistake that in 16 blah blah blah, whenever it was, Descartes proposed that we were mind. I think, therefore I am. And as Steiner, in his guise perhaps as spiritual master, proclaimed, this set us back. This was simply wrong. It's simply wrong. And yet my education system, I imagine yours, the philosophers in the West, all adhered to this idea of mind over everything else. It's become a bit anachronistic now. It's a little bit different. We learnt, for example, in the last 50 years, when we found that people working with their hands and doing practical things are very important to us, and it's greatly skilled. And the world has changed in all sorts of ways. But 50 years ago or so, it was purely Cartesian in its approach, education, and so everything bolstered this idea of mind that I and most of my peers took into the psycho-spiritual endeavor. And I think every lesson was paring away some part of that identity. Thank God.
You mentioned as part of your experiences kirtan. I recently participated in a kirtan meditation with a yoga monk to discover that it wasn't quite my thing, but you never know until you try these things. You start to get into this lecture quite a focus on spiritual practice. as well as spiritual status. And there's some interesting things you share in this lecture about that. But one thing I want to ask you about is you talk about how some of what passes as spiritual practice is doing-oriented practice. And examples might include, yoga, even kirtan could be an example, labyrinth walks, even walking in nature. And I know my experience has shown me that even meditation can fool me into a doing-oriented practice as opposed to a being-oriented practice, which you talk about in the lecture. And what I wanted to ask is, how does one turn a doing into being when it comes to spiritual practice, or any other practice for that matter? And I might ask you to begin by sharing with those listening, what is a being-oriented practice from a spiritual perspective? And then if you could respond to, how does one turn a doing into a being-oriented practice, if one even wanted to?
I wonder if, let's go with the question as it stands, but I wonder in a way whether it's the right question, in a sense that I don't know if you do. I don't know if you turn a doing practice into a being practice, but I take your point. The being and the doing aspects of being a human being, are that being precedes doing. Being then is prior to doing,
right.
And it's also closer to source. Because it's prior, it is more authentic. It is, and we know this in a sense, because we know, people listening will tend to know, people who at various stages in their life fall into despair and futility and no hope. To the degree they may take their own lives, for example, or abandon their lives, or suffer a crisis, or so-called mental breakdown, and all these kinds of things. It's become normal in many ways, and I would suggest that a general understanding of that is a general understanding. So we'd have to pick through individual cases to really understand. But I say, generally speaking, the reasons for that are that we have, by and large, in this society, valued doing over being, which is the wrong way around. And then we do things and we achieve status and prestige and, fulfill the desired body, materialism and blah, 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 and all of this. And then the person often wakes up in the middle of that and says, well, what's this about? Who's in the middle of all of this? I've left myself out somehow. And it's literally how it appears in my experience and in my practice. People feel they've become invisible, or there's a deluge of all of this activity that has buried them. Or they may feel transparent, or their split may widen, and then you may get certain mental illnesses like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, dissociated personality, and all this kind of thing. Because the pressure's come down and the person's been obliterated, at least in their wholeness. Mm-hmm. So if we prioritize being, which we don't, and if we had a place in education and in societal mores where we actually valued, through acknowledging and recognizing the being center of ourselves as people, then in a sense we can't go wrong, because you have a kind of gauge there, and also you're connected, and also you're empowered and enabled to connect with each other, with activities, with life, in this meeting with life. Otherwise it's peripheral. So there's just, this aspect of me go to work. And this is another thing you find in counselling. I do, I'm sure you do too. People who are something or other at work, they have to go home, be something or other else, and they go out with their friends and they're something or other else. And you see, we go on and on. You have a fractured personality just waiting for a critical mass that's going to happen at age 50 or maybe 35, or it's happening all the time. It's just so normal, and in a sense we don't have a quality or a profound, authentic account of why that is. But the reason that is essentially that people are not in touch with their beings. Now, in spiritual practice, being is central. What you do is what you do. That it is connected, grounded, sourced in the inner being is absolutely what it's all about. So in that story I told somewhere or other with the Zen monk who was doing the closing ceremony in the Zendo, when I was sitting in Zendo one day, he just padded in and he padded up and he blew the candles, and there's all these other things, just ordinary activities going on, but I was in tears. I don't know why I was in tears, but there wasn't anything that he was doing that wasn't full of significance and moment and portent. There wasn't anything that he was doing that wasn't connected. And I can think of that many other times in my life. And finally, just to mention it, because he was an old love of mine in the spiritual teacher mastership, was Thich Nhat Hanh, who says, Thich Nhat Hanh said, you can do the washing up to do the washing up, or you can just do the washing up. And what I understand him to be saying in that is you can do what you do for ulterior motive, for some outcome, in which case at least a part of you is not going to be present in the act, or you just do it because that is the present and you are absorbed in that present moment. So you can do whatever you do for its own, for the sake of doing it, because it has an outcome, however subtle, or you just do it. We're doing this now. Why are we doing this? And anybody listening to this who's listening to this, that part of them that's listening to it for a reason, that's got to go at some point. And then you're just listening. And although that sounds like less, it's more, isn't it? Because it takes you in, you see.
I want to thank you for a great gift you just offered me in that sharing, and I'm going to trust that many others who will listen to this will receive the same gift. And it was part of a few minutes back where you talked about how we bring different selves to different parts of our life. So we may go to work and there's an aspect of us that we bring to work, but then when we get home there's a different aspect, and it leading to this fracturedness. And as you shared that, this wave of compassion just washed through me, because I remember so well that fracturedness. I'd get up in the morning, I'd put on my suit, which was a shield, and I'd go to work, and I'd be a certain Rob. But then when I'd leave the office, I'd be a different Rob. And I remember that so well because it's different now. And so I just want to thank you for that reminder.
Thank you.
You go on to talk about there being no shortcuts, or talking about surrendering to the ego. And I remember reading it and relating so well to the idea that there are no shortcuts when it comes to surrendering to the ego. But in those few exceptions you speak of, and I'm going to read the quote shortly. I wanted to ask you, what is going on? What are these people? Are they old souls? So here was the quote. All seeking is of the ego. All of it reinforces and originates from an ego message that you are not enough exactly as you are. This is there is no shortcut. The surrendering of ego forces that allows you to embrace the spiritual practice of non-seeking is deeply unconscious. You will inevitably, with very few exceptions, have to work at it, paradoxically. Freedom follows constraint, like Picasso breaking the rules only after he had first learned how to paint. Beautiful metaphor. So I wanted to ask you, in those exceptions you speak of, because again you said you will inevitably, with very few exceptions, have to work at it paradoxically, this surrendering to the ego. And a paradox indeed. But in those very few exceptions, what's going on?
Well, I don't know. We don't know. You don't. I mean, perhaps one of the important points to make about it is that this is an impersonal matter, an impersonal matter. Because, I'm not a fan of sports or anything like that, but in a way we're in a very competitive sort of business here. There's nothing more competitive than spiritual people meditating, people comparing gurus, people comparing time that they've spent and insights and breakthroughs and enlightening experiences and all of this. And curiously, weirdly and strangely, perhaps because the ego is going to get in on the act, whatever, there's a lot of hierarchical approach to something that, of course, in a way, isn't relevant to hierarchy or really attainment or progress or a comparative standing of beings and all of this. So the people, or those rare ones who exist amongst us, who may be teachers, who may be masters, who may start world religions, but they may equally well have never been heard of again, even if they were heard of once. We may never have known who they are, because I think that's also the case. I think we know that's the case. You don't have to be a teacher just because you've experienced third stage samadhi, for example. Mm-hmm. You may just wrap it up and go someplace, like someplace. So I don't know. I don't think anybody knows today. I think that at some point we have to let go of the division and the separation, not just merely talk about it, and understand very profoundly that the great difficulty about spirituality per se, the real thing, is that it isn't about you, it isn't about you and me, it isn't about any separation in consciousness, it's about unity. It's in a field of non-division and non-separateness, and therefore when we refer to a rare being, or the very, very few who, in a sense, don't have to work at it, and to seem to be the case, we have from what seem to be legitimate accounts, people who don't have to work about it. They're not friends of mine, they're people I've read about, you perhaps have read about. That something extraordinary is happening there. And if we then say something like, oh, well, they're old souls, they had many great lives, they were saints many times over, I don't know, it sounds like fiction to me. I'm not going there. It's a nice piece of poetry. I wouldn't mind writing it or it being a picture, but you see, pictures and poetry and these sorts of explanations that are really artistic are merely bridges from the world of material events and appearances to a world where there is no material events or appearances whatsoever, because there's no separation. Therefore, the the gifted ones, the rare ones, the enlightened ones, are no more merely than ourselves. See, they are ourselves. And if you want to get prideful, if you want to really do something with the ego, just say that you are one of them, feel what you are to be one of them. Nisargadatta, Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj pointed this out in a wonderful passage in, can't remember which book it was, of his dialogues with people. He said, everybody, when they read the Bhagavad Gita, identifies with Arjuna. Try identifying with Krishna in the chariot. And that, I thought, was a marvelous piece of heresy, marvelous piece of religious heresy, because he's right. You know, up to this point, I think we all would read the Bhagavad Gita and we'd all think, well, we're the human being receiving the yogic teachings from God in the form of Krishna, who is Vishnu, who is Brahman, therefore, etc., etc. There's the triune from Hinduism, from the Vedas, and you know, here we are listening to this, and these things are extraordinarily hard to practice. They are how you behave from the point of view of enlightenment. For example, if you're doing something, you're absolutely immersed in it, you're absorbed in that moment, and you don't allow your mind to go ahead before you, because you're totally there in the moment. And you also, if it all goes wrong, and even if shame is heaped on your head, it doesn't make any difference to you. So these things are extraordinarily hard for us as human beings. But instead of putting us in the school listening to this, Nisargadatta says, be the teaching, be the teacher, be the master. And then you see you have this expansion out of the limitations of the separate self. So I think that we should try and understand the guru or the spiritual teacher or the enlightened being as ourselves, taking a step on the bridge towards the divine person, who is in a sense, not in a sense, who is authentically all of us and everything, not just human beings.
Beautiful way to end our time here today with this interview. And when we come together the next time, the next lecture, I believe the last lecture in this series, is the threshold of transformation. And I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Till then.